We'll get started in about 30 seconds. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our LACO LCAP-State and Federal Programs Units workshop on implementing equitable services to eligible private school participants under ESSA. Before we get started, we'd like to know how many of you are new to this position where you have to implement the equitable services. If you could put in the chat, I guess if you're new, answer yes. If you're not new, then put a no. But definitely want to see who's new and joining us for the first time. Old. Not new. That's nice. Great. Great. So we have a few new people, and this tends to be a smaller audience because, district level personnel are the ones that are generally implementing at the district level the equitable services. So welcome to everyone. Great. Okay. I'm Adrienne Balcazar, and I'm here as the project director of the LCAP-State and Federal Programs Unit, and I'd like to introduce the rest of our team. Today we have Debbie Cano, we have Helen Choi, Augustine Garcia, Rachel Garcia, Jeannie Keith, and Anita Lomeli. I also want to introduce our support staff, Maribel Leyva and Carol Thomas. To access today's presentation, we ask that you click on the link in the chat, and then it will take you to our Canvas page. And the presentation can be accessed through the icon as shown here on the slide. You'll also find the agenda and resources for today's workshop. And we are recording today's workshop, so we will be posting that link. And also we will be sending out a Q&A for those questions that you have. And we ask you to place those questions in the chat so that we can compile them and answer any of those questions that we can answer right away. And for those others that we have to do a little more digging, we will compile them and put them all on a Q&A and email them to you. Today's agenda is we're going to have an overview, then we'll look at the consultation process. We'll look at what equitable share is and for the Title I program, and also the equitable share for the other federal programs. We'll look at some key requirements of the public control of funds, allowable uses, and the obligation of funds. And we'll end with my personal favorite, the FPM's equitable services and all the documentation that's needed. And so again, please place your questions in the chat and we will answer those questions either today or through a follow-up with an emailed version of the Q&A. And so now I will turn it over to Anita to go over the outcomes for today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Adrienne. And so today, taking a look at our outcomes for the day, we will be focusing on the district's role and responsibilities for equitable services, and that includes requirements related to the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of program services, as well as the fiscal control of the program and program funds. We will also spend some time looking at how to determine the proportional share for individual programs, as this does vary by program. Consultation is a critical component of equitable services, and with this in mind, we're going to spend a good amount of time on consultation requirements, which are specified in law. And finally, we will leave you with some places where you can find additional resources and support. So speaking of resources, we have a comprehensive handbook available to add to your SFP library. This is user-friendly and informative handbook, and it includes ESSA requirements for equitable services related to all applicable federal programs, including recent updates and clarifications. You'll also find common definitions, Q&As to get you started, fiscal regulations, and the step-by-step process of the consultation requirement. There are separate sections addressing the differences in requirements for various federal programs such as Title I Part A and C, Title II, Title III, and Title IV Parts A and B. Requirements defined in the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, commonly referred to as EDGAR, are also explained in this handbook. And in addition, you'll have electronic access to the sample forms and support materials you can use for consultation and documentation. And you'll be able to edit and personalize the documents for your needs. The link on this slide will take you to the order form. You can also access it from the LACO website under the Service tab, then click on Accountability, Support, and Monitoring under Services for Districts. And so a few of you said that you were new to equitable services, and you might be asking yourself, how is it that we got to this place where federal funds provide services that reach out beyond the public schools and into the nonprofit private school sector? That's a great question, and its answer can be found by looking back at the historical context. And we share this information because it's helpful for you to understand why we do the things that we do. So let's take a look at how we got here. In 1962, President Kennedy appointed Harvard School of Education Dean Francis Keppel to be the U.S. Commissioner of Education. And Keppel was known for his dynamic personality, and he had a knack for building relationships and putting people at ease. And just a few years later, Keppel's strength and interpersonal intelligence would serve President Lyndon B. Johnson very well. President Johnson's war on poverty included what was to become the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And this piece of legislation was very personal to Johnson since he had grown up in poverty and credited education for taking him out of it. But he hit some major roadblocks at the onset of trying to get the legislation passed. And one of those roadblocks was over services to private schools. Now, teacher unions and organizations at the time were opposed to providing funding to private schools. On the other hand, as you can imagine, private school organization and church groups were not opposed to the idea and threatened to block the passage of this act if they weren't included. And so enter Frank Keppel. He came up with a compromise that satisfied all of the advocacy groups. And his compromise was that federal funds would not go to private schools. Instead, Keppel helped to ensure the legislation was designed in such a way that all children in need at both public and non-public schools would be served. And so the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in 1965, and getting all sides to a consensus was known as Keppel's Compromise. And it's hard to believe that we're coming up on the 60-year anniversary of this act just next year. And so in the landmark Supreme Court case, so as you can imagine, things weren't smooth sailing for ESSA even after Keppel's compromise. And in 1971, we had to implement the Lemon Test, and this came about over the First Amendment Establishment Clause, which requires that government maintain neutrality towards religion. And in the landmark Supreme Court case, Lemon versus Kurtzman, a three-pronged test was developed for Establishment Clause cases. Services to private schools had to be secular. They could not advance or inhibit religion, and there could be no entanglement of government agencies with religious organizations. In 1985, there was another court case, Grand Rapids School District versus Ball. And in that case, the Supreme Court found that the Grand Rapids School District did not pass the Lemon Test because the Equitable Services Program employed parochial school teachers and used both public and religious school facilities. In addition, secular classes were offered to children at parochial facilities leased by the state. And during that same year, the verdict in Aguilar versus Felton prohibited services at private schools. Teachers and staff were not allowed to go onto the private school site. And lots of money then was spent on portable buildings and trailers that they used to house the Title I program at the time. And that went on for about 10 years until 1997, when Augustini versus Felton reversed that ruling and now allowed public school teachers to go onto the campuses of private schools to provide secular equitable services. The next situation that came up were concerns with consultation, and that became a big issue with the Department of Education. They were seeing that consultation wasn't taking place appropriately and that basically school districts were offering services just to private school children, but they weren't consulting with the private school in that process. And in 2010, the United States Department of Education did a review of California's programs, and they found several issues that became a compliance focus. For one, districts were not maintaining control of the program and services, which is a requirement, and districts were not determining equitable share accurately. And also, services provided were benefiting the private school. Remember that services cannot benefit the private school, only the eligible students. Evaluations of the services or program were not taking place, and selection criteria was not effective. Then, in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act made some additional changes to the Title I formula, added some requirements for consultation, and it clarified some of the carryover requirements, and it added the state ombudsman. So let's take a look at that role now. The ombudsman, or in California's case, the ombudswoman, was added to ensure that private school children, teachers, and other personnel receive the services equitably in comparison to the public schools. And essentially, the ombudsman is sort of the intermediary between the private school and the school district when there are issues, questions, or disputes. Our Equitable Services Ombudsman for the state is Sylvia Hanna, and she can be reached at the email address listed on this slide. She's the person to contact if you have questions, if you anticipate a problem, or you aren't sure of something. She may be contacted by either the administrator from the LEA or from the private school. There is a CDE Equitable Services Ombudsman webpage, and it provides you program contacts for other federal programs that require equitable services along with other pertinent information. And so now that we reviewed how equitable services came about, we learned about some of the back and forth issues and the need for an ombudsman, we get to, in a nutshell, what are equitable services? So equitable services refer to educational services and resources that are provided to eligible students and teachers in eligible nonprofit private schools using federal education program funds. And ESSA requires that access to equitable services be offered to eligible private school students, teachers, their families, and other educational personnel. However, the participation by private schools is not required. Services provided must be allowable and comparable to those services provided to public school students and teachers participating in the program. The services can be different from those services provided to public school participants, as services are based on the needs of private school students and teachers, and services provided must also be evaluated for effectiveness. It's also important to note that any services provided must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological, and services must also supplement and in no case supplant the basic level of services that the private school is responsible for providing to their students, staff, and parents. Additionally, funds may not be provided directly to a private school. Equitable services only apply to federal funds and not to any state funds. And listed on this slide are the ESSA programs to which they apply. Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, Title III Part A, Title IV Part A, Title IV Part B, and Project Serve. As you can see, most are formula grant programs with the exception of Title IV Part B, which is the 21st Century Schools Program, a competitive grant. Now, the requirements for each of the programs we saw on the previous slide follow the program requirements for public schools, with some exceptions regarding allowability of cost. As with public school programs, the services are to be supplemental in nature and provide similar types of services. These are some important questions to ask, however. Does the service or program increase academic achievement? Is the program offered for professional development based on the needs of students? What supplemental programs are being provided for identified ELs and immigrant students? And what is the supplemental Title IV program? And does it support a well-rounded education? Does it improve school conditions for student learning or for the effective use of technology? The bottom line is that you don't start with the funding. You start with the needs of students and the services that will increase academic achievement. As you will see later in this presentation, Title I is significantly different in how funding is determined and how services are provided. This is primarily because Title I is a school-level program, so eligibility is based on individual students and whether or not they reside in the attendance area of a district-identified Title I public school. For Title I only, you may need to service eligible students attending nonprofit private schools outside of district boundaries. And in today's presentation, we will provide you with specifics regarding equitable services for Title I programs and the specifics for the rest of the federal programs, which do differ from Title I in this regard. So thank you all very much for your attention. And next, Rachel will be discussing the requirement of consultation.
Thank you, Anita, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Anita mentioned, in this section, we'll be taking a look at the requirements for the consultation process. Under ESSA, LEAs are required to consult with private school officials regarding the provision of equitable services. And so consultation is not something that just happens once a year. It's an ongoing process. This means that consultation must occur during the design and development of the program, as well as throughout implementation of the program. And the consultation process, it helps to establish clear guidelines regarding how equitable services will be provided for each of the applicable programs. This slide here provides an overview of the consultation process and the components that we will be reviewing in this section. And so as mentioned on the previous slide, consultation must be ongoing. So this process involves ongoing discussions and meetings between public and private school officials on key topics related to the provision of equitable services. It's also important to note that consultation is the responsibility of the school district. And the goal is to reach agreement on how to provide equitable and effective programs for eligible private school students, teachers, and families. So the first step in the process is to identify eligible private schools. Only nonprofit private schools that have submitted an affidavit to the CDE may participate in equitable services. And so there are two ways to access the list of eligible private schools. The first link provided on the slide will take you to the CDE website, where you can access a list of all private schools with an affidavit on file. And the second link provided on the slide is a searchable database that allows a search by district for the private schools located within the district boundaries. For this database, a county password is required to access it. And so we've included the password for LA County on the slide. However, other counties must contact the CDE private school office for their specific county password. Also, be sure to filter the list for nonprofit private schools. Another thing we want to note is that we've heard that the CDE updates this list in March. So if you've already checked the list or database to get started on the consultation process for next year's services, you'll want to be sure to check it again, just in case any new schools have been added to the list. And then another important thing to keep in mind is that the CDE does not verify the accuracy of the affidavit information that's provided by private schools. And the CDE expects school districts to verify the accuracy of student enrollment data, as well as tax exempt status through the consultation process. And this expectation is noted on the consolidated application nonprofit private school consultation page that gets submitted with the spring CONAP. Next slide. So in terms of private school participation, the requirements for Title I Part A are different than that of Title I Part C and Titles II, III, and IV. So for Title I Part A, nonprofit private schools, both within and outside of the district's boundaries, may be eligible to participate because funding and services are based on the student's residence in a Title I school attendance area. So for example, if you have a low-income student who lives in a Title I school attendance area in your district, but attends a nonprofit private school outside of your district boundaries, then this student would generate funds for Title I services. It's also important to remember that poverty does not determine who actually receives Title I services. To be eligible for Title I services, private school students must live in a Title I school attendance area and also be failing or most at risk of failing based on multiple educationally related criteria that's agreed upon during the consultation process. For Title I Part C and Titles II, III, and IV, only nonprofit private schools within the district's boundaries may participate. So once you've checked the CDE list and identified the eligible nonprofit private schools, the next step is to contact them to inform them of the programs and services for which their students, teachers, and families may be eligible. And again, this is a district responsibility. So it's up to the district to initiate contact with the private schools. And keep in mind that this must be done on an annual basis. It's recommended that districts reach out to eligible private schools around February to begin consultation early enough to prepare for the next year, so that services are implemented in a timely manner. Most districts use some sort of invitation letter or an intent to participate letter to initiate this contact with private schools. In this letter, you would include a brief description of the applicable programs for which your district participates, and you may also request that the private school indicate their intent to participate in any or all applicable programs. You would then follow up with an informational meeting regarding the programs. If you don't receive a response from private school officials, you should follow up with the private school several times and be sure to maintain documentation of all of the attempts to contact private school officials. It's also a good idea to send letters or communication by certified mail or emails with a read receipt to document that it was actually received or read by the private school official. Okay, so how do you determine which nonprofit private schools to contact? So again, for federal programs such as Title I, Part C, Titles II, III, and IV, you would contact private schools located within your district boundaries. But for Title I, Part A, you would contact private schools within your district's boundaries, as well as private schools in adjoining districts to determine if they have eligible students enrolled. So here on this slide, we've included a frequently asked question from the Title I non-regulatory guidance that explains which private schools must be contacted for Title I Part A. And as you can see, the response indicates that for Title I Part A, LEAs are responsible for contacting private schools within the district boundaries and must additionally contact private schools outside of the district boundaries if the LEA has reason to believe that students who reside in its Title I attendance public school areas attend those private schools. And on the next few slides, we have a few screenshots of some sample outreach letters that we've included with today's materials to assist you with this process. So here we see a sample letter that can be used to reach out to nonprofit private schools located within your district's boundaries. And so for this letter, you would just include the federal programs that your LEA operates. Next, we have two sample letters to assist you with reaching out to private schools outside of your district boundaries for Title I Part A. And so the first letter is a sample letter that can be used to reach out to Title I directors in adjoining districts. The letter asks Title I directors in adjoining districts if they could ask private school officials, as they're consulting with them, if the private school has any students from your district. And it also provides a format for sharing this information with you. Although it's not required that you contact directors in adjoining districts, many districts do this as a way to assist each other in identifying students who live in their attendance area but are attending private schools in those adjoining districts. The second letter is a sample letter that can be used to reach out to nonprofit private schools outside of your district boundaries for Title I Part A. It's similar to the letter on the previous slide, but it only includes information related to Title I. And so you would send this letter to private schools outside of your district if you have reason to believe that students who live in your Title I attendance areas are attending these schools. Okay, so as previously mentioned, the intent to participate letter or invitation letter should be followed up with an informational meeting to provide more specific information about the programs that private school students, teachers, and families may be eligible to participate in, as well as the procedures for participating. And so some of the topics that could be addressed at this initial meeting are listed on this slide. So for example, it would be important to explain the consultation process and the required topics that must be addressed through consultation. Some other possible topics include explaining the purpose of the federal programs available and the services allowed under each program. Also explaining that the district is responsible for developing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating the programs. Providing funding estimates for the next school year, as well as the process that will be used to determine private school participants' equitable share. It would also be important to verify the name and contact information for the private school official designated to represent the private school. And also scheduling any future meetings and timelines for consultation. This initial meeting should set the tone for your consultation with private school officials, and convey the message that it's about designing equitable and effective programs for eligible participants based on the needs of students, and that it's not about the private school just sending the district a wish list. Next slide. So in order to ensure that consultation is timely and meaningful, it must begin early enough to prepare for the next school year. So that means consultation must occur before the district makes any decision that can impact the participation of private school students, teachers, other educational personnel, and families. It must also be ongoing throughout the year to ensure effective implementation, as well as the evaluation of services. Another important thing to keep in mind is that a unilateral offer of services by a district with no opportunity for discussion or the application of a blanket rule is not considered adequate consultation. The consultation process must provide an opportunity for private school officials to express their views and to also have those views considered. So when consulting with private school officials regarding equitable services, there are required topics that must be addressed. And so the topics that are listed on this slide are required for all federal programs. So during these ongoing discussions and meetings with private school officials, some of the topics that will need to be discussed include how the private school students' needs will be identified, what services will be offered, and how, where, and by whom will they be provided? How will the services be assessed, and how will those results be used to improve services? Also, the size and scope of services, including the equitable share, and how that amount is determined. And how and when the district will make decisions about the delivery of services. So here we see additional required consultation topics. And just to note, the first three on the slide are required for all federal programs, whereas the last three topics on the slide are only applicable to Title I. If the LEA disagrees with the private school officials on the provision of services through a contract, the LEA must provide in writing to the private school official the reason why it disagrees. Consultation must also address whether the LEA will provide services directly or through a contract with a third-party provider, and whether to provide equitable services by pooling funds or on a school-by-school basis. It's also important to note that LEA and private school officials must agree to the pooling of funds through consultation, and the LEA may not unilaterally make the decision to pool funds. And then for Title I only, consultation will also need to address the method that will be used to determine low-income children, when services will be provided, including the approximate time of day, and also whether to consolidate Title I equitable services funds with funds available under other programs. And so just keep in mind that this does not mean that LEAs are able to consolidate funds across programs, but rather coordinate the use of funds to maximize services. So districts must also maintain documentation that verifies that it has met the requirement for timely and meaningful consultation and that it has provided equitable services. So this documentation includes intent to participate letters, written affirmations of consultation, and evidence of consultation attempts. And in order to document outreach to private schools, districts should ensure that any communication mailed is sent via certified mail, and then anything emailed, again, should be sent with read receipts. And then other examples of documentation include meeting agendas and minutes, written explanations of disagreements, data that's collected to assess or evaluate services, contracts with third-party providers, any monitoring and assessment tools, inventory records, and then also the identification criteria for student eligibility for Title I services. Next slide, please. And so here we see some screenshots of the CDE's sample intent to participate and written affirmation letters. And so you can access these documents at the link provided on the slide. And so as mentioned, most districts use some sort of intent to participate form or letter to make that initial contact with private schools. And so really the consultation process is initiated annually when the district reaches out to private schools to explain the intent and purposes of the applicable federal programs that their students and staff may be eligible to participate in. It's important to obtain a copy of the intent to participate form from each private school, whether or not that school intends to participate. And you may also include a deadline by which the private schools need to respond and identify any potential consequences for not meeting that deadline. And you would then begin the consultation process with private schools that have indicated their intent to participate. Now, districts are required to maintain in its records a written affirmation signed by each nonprofit private school to document that timely and meaningful consultation has occurred. And private school officials must have the option to indicate their belief that timely and meaningful consultation has not occurred, or that the program design for private school participants is not equitable. And this information, again, it's reported to the CDE through the nonprofit private school consultation page with the spring CONAP submission in June. And on the next slide, we have a screenshot of that form. And so on this form, LEAs are asked to indicate for each nonprofit private school if consultation occurred, if consultation agreement was met, if there is a signed written affirmation on file, and then also provide a consultation code indicating the private school's belief that timely and meaningful consultation has or has not occurred, or if the program design is not equitable. So keep in mind as you're beginning the consultation process with private schools for programs and services for the 2024-25 school year, you'll be reporting this information to the CDE through the spring CONAP submission in June. And then just also remember to maintain documentation from private schools that decline services, as well as documentation of your attempts of outreach to those private schools that don't respond to you. So here we see a sample private school consultation timeline that has been adapted from a sample CDE timeline. And so we've included the link to the CDE sample at the bottom of the slide for reference. And so again, as mentioned, it's recommended that districts begin this process for the next year's services in February to ensure that services begin in a timely manner. And also, as mentioned, consultation should be ongoing throughout the year. So as you can see in the timeline, there may be times during the year where districts are consulting with private school officials on both the current year's services as well as the next year's services. And so we've also included a sample consultation checklist with today's materials to assist you with this process. And so this checklist basically combines all of the steps and components that were shared in this section into a checklist format. And so hopefully this resource will be helpful as you begin the process for 2024-25 services. And so just some final consultation reminders. Consultation really is key to implementing effective programs. And again, it must be timely and meaningful and take place before the district makes any decisions. And it must be ongoing throughout the school year to help ensure effective implementation. And so really the goal of all parties should be to reach agreement on the provision of equitable services. And so all agreement should be clear, in writing, and form the basis of services to be provided and the funds to be expended. And so effective consultation, it really helps to ensure that the services provided meet the needs of the eligible participants. And it also helps to avoid those last-minute spending requests from private schools. And so that concludes this section. I will now turn it over to Augustine.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone. So this next section on equitable share will be divided into two parts. First, I'll go over equitable share and the Title I Part A program, followed by Debbie, who will go over equitable share and other federal programs. So under ESSA Section 8501A3A, there's a requirement that the educational services must be equitable in comparison to the services and other benefits that the district is providing for their own students. Equitable share ensures that there's an equitable participation of private school students, teachers, and families. These services are also considered to be equitable when the district meets the expenditure requirements of the federal program and when the district provides a timely program that meets the educational needs of its participants. So let's begin with equitable share and the Title I Part A program. So there are specific methods that must be followed in determining the federal program funding. Determining the proportional share depends on the federal program because, as mentioned earlier by Anita and Rachel, the methodology for the Title I program is significantly different from the other federal programs. And it can be confusing for Title I because the proportional share is based on where the student lives as compared to the methodology for other programs, which depends on the location of the private schools that are in the district's boundaries. So here are some key points about funding for Title I equitable services. First of all, the proportional share must be calculated from the total amount of the Title I allocation the district receives. It must be taken first, off the top, and set aside for equitable services. The funds must be used to implement the Title I program in the same fiscal year the district receives them. The amounts can be verified through the CON app, and the state also notifies the private schools of the allocation of funds. So here are the steps to be taken in order to determine the Title I proportional share. First, you'll need to identify the private school students who will generate the funding. You'll need to know the low-income families that are in eligible private schools within your district and adjoining districts. Next, you'll need to consult with the private school in order to determine what method you will use to measure the poverty level. Together, you will decide if you're going to use the same data as public school students, a survey of private school parents asking for income data, a low-income percentage of each participating public school attendance area, this is referred to as proportionality, or an equated measure of low income correlated with the measure of low income used to count public school children. After you have agreed on what method to measure poverty, you will need to collect the poverty data from the private school families. The poverty data will need to be filtered in order to collect the number of students ages 5 through 17 who are from low-income families and attend the eligible private schools in your district. If needed, you will need to provide the private school with the income eligibility forms to be used. So now that you have all your poverty data, you can determine the proportional share of funds reserved for Title I services for private school students. First, you must determine the equitable services proportional percentage rate. To do this, you combine the total public schools low income count with the total participating nonprofit private schools low income count to get the total number of public and private school low income students. Then you must divide the number of low income private school students by the total number of public and private school low income students. This will give you the proportional percentage rate, or PPR. You will then multiply the proportional percentage rate by your total Title I Part A entitlement. This will give you the total proportional share available for services to eligible students in the participating private schools. Once you know how much you have for the private schools, you must again consult with each of the private schools to determine the needs and services. You will also include in the discussion any option for pooling, transferability, or coordination with other funds during the consultation meeting. So let's practice using the formula for proportional share to determine equitable expenditures using this example. Let's say the number of the LEA's low-income students is 1,350, and the number of participating nonprofit private school low-income students is 150. If we add these two, we get 1,500 total students. So now to get our proportional percentage rate, we take our 150 private school low-income students and divide that by our total of 1,500 students. We get 1/10, or 10%. If the LEA's total Title I Part A entitlement is $1 million and 10% of that is taken off the top, then the private school proportional share is $100,000. Now, if the district's allocation is over $500,000, which in this example it is, then the LEA must reserve an equal percentage with a required minimum of 1% from the equitable services proportional share to carry out parent and family engagement activities of participating nonprofit private school students. And as you can see, the minimum 1% reservation for parent and family engagement in the private schools here is $1,000. After the parent and family engagement reservation, the amount the LEA shall allocate for equitable services is $99,000. And here's what the proportional share work will look like on the Khan app. The arrow is pointing to the field where the sum of public and nonprofit private school low-income students data is inputted. Here, the Khan app will calculate the percentage rate. In this case, 91 nonprofit private school students divided by 254 total participating public and nonprofit private school low-income students gives us a PPR of 35.83%. The next section of the private school equitable services reservations page from the Khan app is where you can find the proportional share dollar amount. This will calculate the proportional share of your equitable services reservation. Again, we take our PPR, which was 35.83%, and multiply it by the total Title I Part A LEA allocation of $551,483, which gives us an equitable services proportional share of $197,596. And here's a screenshot from the bottom of the private school equitable services reservations page of the Khan app. This is where the Khan app addresses parent engagement. As you can see, the minimum required reservation for parent and family engagement based off of the proportional share on this last slide was $1,976. This LEA decided it needed more than that 1% for its family and parent engagement, so they upped it 5.6% or $11,152. Okay, so let's practice determining who generates funding for the nonprofit private schools. In the blue is your district. Your district has a Title I school and a non-Title I school within its boundaries. Next, let's look at the private schools. There are private schools whose physical location is within your district boundaries. In this example, there's one private school in the Title I school's attendance area and another private school within the non-Title I school's attendance area. In the gray, you can see other private schools in the districts that are adjoining or surrounding your district. Now, let's look at the 6 students. Let's say they're all low-income students. Students 1 through 3 live in the attendance area of the Title I school, and students 4 through 6 live in the attendance area of the non-Title I school. The arrows indicate which private school they are attending. Notice that students 3 and 4 are attending the same private school in the surrounding district. Next slide, please. Low-income students 1, 2, and 3 all live in the Title I school attendance area. Because they live in the Title I school attendance area, all 3 of these low-income students will generate Title I funding, no matter which nonprofit private school they attend. Remember, where the student resides is what determines whether or not they generate funding for the private schools. Now let's look at low-income students 4, 5, and 6. They all live in a non-Title I school attendance area. All 3 of these low-income students will not generate any funding for the private school because they live in the attendance area of a non-Title I school. Additionally, you can see that surrounding District 3, there at the bottom, will have some low-income students that generate funding and other low-income students that do not generate funding. So now that we've determined the Title I funding, who receives the academic services? Well, here you must identify which students will receive Title I services. ESSA and the Code of Federal Regulations state that Title I services are for students attending participating nonprofit private schools identified by the LEA as failing or most at risk of failing and reside in the LEA participating school attendance area. It is these students that are eligible for equitable services. Here are some key reminders when identifying students for services. Again, remember, they must reside in the Title I attendance area. They must meet multiple educationally related objective criteria agreed to in consultation. A couple of examples are the Iowa assessments or iReady. Please be aware that there are some students who reside in Title I school attendance area that are automatically eligible, such as our homeless youth, our students in Head Start, Even Start, Title I pre-K, the migrant program, or children in a local institution for neglected or delinquent children, or youth attending a community day program for such children in the last 2 years. Lastly, it's important to remember that poverty is not a criteria for services. Now, when you are providing the Title I services, remember it must be based on a needs assessment and with consultation. Your Title I program is run using the targeted assistance model. If you're hiring your own district employees to provide the Title I services, they must meet the state credential requirements. And lastly, you're implementing your Title I program. You can't just provide materials and supplies and be in compliance with the federal requirements. Remember, it's not a pot of money, it's a program. So let's check for understanding a little bit. Who generates funding and who receives services? Here we have 3 students. We have Aria, Cosmo, and Win. Take a moment to analyze each student profile to determine if A, they generate funding, and B, are eligible to receive Title I services. We'll give you 47 seconds to jot down your ideas if you have a notepad next to you, or if you'd like, you can also type in the chat. 47 seconds start now. Okie dokie, let's move on to our next slide and check our answers. Let's start with Aria. This student is a low-income student that lives in the Title I school attendance area and is high achieving. Does Aria generate funding? Yes. Does Aria receive Title I services though? No, because Aria is not failing or most at risk of failing as defined in ESSA and the Code of Federal Regulations. But what about Cosmo? This student is a low-income student that does not live in a Title I school attendance area and is low achieving. Does he generate funding? No. And does Cosmo receive Title I services? Again, no. Cosmo would not receive Title I services because based on where they live, they would not be attending your non-Title I school. And finally, let's take a look at Win. This student is a high-income student that lives in the Title I school attendance area and is low achieving. Does Win generate funding? No. Does Win receive Title I services? Yes, because they are failing or most at risk of failing as defined in ESSA and the Code of Federal Regulations. So how'd you do? I'm sure you did great. Thank you for your engagement, and now I'll pass it over to Debbie, who will cover Equitable Share and our other federal programs.
Thank you, Augustine. Good afternoon, everybody. Ready to go through the Equitable Share of other federal programs. Next slide. So the other federal programs that we're talking about are Title I Part C, Title II, Title III, and Title IV A and B. So with these titles differ from Title I because with you will only serve the nonprofit private schools that are located within your district boundaries. There is no requirement to contact private schools outside of your district boundaries for these programs, as with Title I Part A. Next slide. So here is a graphic that illustrates which private schools will be served by your district for Title I Part C and Titles 2, 3, and 4. In this scenario, your district is in the middle, indicated by DO, and is within those black boundaries. There are a number of private schools near your DO. So which private schools would you need to reach out to? You're only required to serve the private schools within your boundaries. So those within the black boundaries of the district office would be served for Title I Part C, Title II, Title III, and Title IV. And this is in contrast to Title I Part A, because as Augustine explained, with Title I Part A, you also reach out to private schools in surrounding districts because of the services follow the students who reside in your district's Title I attendance areas, but may be attending schools outside of your district boundaries. But with these other federal programs, you are not required to serve any of the private schools outside of your district boundaries. So again, Title I Part C is different from Title I Part A in that you are only required to provide services to eligible students attending private schools within your district boundaries. The CDE Migrant Education Program Regions and Migrant Education Program LEAs assist participating nonprofit private schools in identifying eligible migrant students. Migrant Education Program funds are used to provide supplemental services or other benefits on an equitable basis to eligible migrant children and their teachers and other educational personnel. These services must be determined through consultation and must be based on the student's needs. Some examples of services and allowable activities include after-school interventions, health services, parent workshop, and professional development for teachers of eligible students. Next slide. Here we see a screenshot of the method of calculating equitable services proportional share for Title I Part C. For Title I Part C, a per pupil amount is determined based on the district's total Title I Part C allocation divided by the number of migrant education program students enrolled in both public and participating nonprofit private schools. You will then multiply the per pupil rate by the number of private school migrant education program participants to determine the equitable share. So for Title II Part A, the district may use these funds to provide professional development activities for private school teachers, principals, and other instructional personnel to address the specific needs of their private school students. Services provided must be allowable under Title II and must also be supplemental to the professional development provided by the private school. One thing to remember is that the services for Title II are determined through the consultation process and must also be based on a needs assessment. The services must address the specific needs of the students enrolled in the private school and not the general needs of the private school. A scenario to avoid is one in which the private school requests reimbursement for a conference that they have already attended, or request late registration for an upcoming conference that was not one that you had both discussed in prior consultation, nor was determined to meet the specified needs. The professional development plan for Title II equitable services should be intentionally planned in advance through consultation. Some examples of professional development activities are included on the slide. One of the questions we often receive is whether or not Title II funds could be used to pay for credential work. And the answer is, it depends. So we recommend being very cautious with this. You will need to ensure that the coursework is tied to the PD needs assessment and the PD plan. And remember, services must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. Next slide. Here we see a screenshot of the CDE's method of calculating equitable service proportional share document for Title II. This document provides a step-by-step walkthrough of the process for determining the equitable share amount for Title II and can be found on the CDE Ombudsman's webpage. We've also included a link to the document. For Title II equitable services, a per pupil amount is determined based on the LEA's total Title II allocation, less administrative costs, and the total enrollment of all public and nonprofit private school students at participating nonprofit private schools. You will then multiply the per pupil rate by the total enrollment of participating nonprofit private schools to determine the amount for equitable services. Now, Title III Part A has two parts, the Title III English Learner Program and the Title III Immigrant Program. For the English Learner Program, the private school would administer the home language survey to students being considered for participation. It should be the same version as the home language survey used by public schools or by the district. If a language other than English is indicated on the home language survey, then the district is required to administer an initial language assessment. The district is responsible for the cost and oversight of this initial assessment. It is also important to note that the district cannot use the LPAC with the private school students. The CDE website has a list of approved tests that may be used to assess English language proficiency of private school students. However, any test mutually agreed upon during consultation that is valid and reliable for assessing English proficiency may be used. EL students at the private school must also be assessed annually to determine continued eligibility for service. Private schools may be eligible to participate in Title III Immigrant Program if the private school student submitted the Student National Origin Report, also known as the SNOR, with the number of eligible immigrant students, and it is located within the boundaries of the LEA that is eligible for and receiving funds for the immigrant student program. Private schools submit the SNOR to CDE via an online reporting system. As a side note, the count of immigrant students in districts is reported in CalPEDS, not the SNOR. For your reference, ESEA defines immigrant students as students who are aged 3 through 21, were not born in the U.S. or U.S. territories, and have been attending a school in the U.S. for less than 36 consecutive months. We've also included a link to the CDE web pages for additional information on equitable services for Title III EL and immigrant programs. Slide. So Title III funds are meant to provide supplemental language instruction services for English learners and supports for immigrant students. Through consultation, the district and each private school will develop a memorandum of understanding, or MOU, that at a minimum describes the services and products to be provided, the estimated costs, and the date of their provision. Some examples of services include assessing English learners, small group instruction, after-school tutoring, professional development for the teachers of ELs or immigrants, and parent and family outreach. But again, this is something that is determined in consultation based on the needs of the students. Slide. And here again, we see a screenshot for the method of calculating equitable services for proportional share for Title III. This document provides the process for determining the equitable share for Title III and can be found on the CDE Ombudsman's page. For Title III, the proportional share is calculated based on the per pupil allocation for the EL and/or immigrant students enrolled in both public and participating nonprofit private schools. Also remember that there is a 2% cap on administrative costs for Title III. The private school should receive an equivalent amount of products and services for each of the EL and immigrant students served as the public school receives for each of its EL and immigrant students, according to the per pupil allocation and student needs. On one last note regarding Title III funding is that the LEA is paid in arrears, or in other words, reimbursed for its services to private school students. The CDE collects data in the Khan app on the number of nonprofit private schools, EL, and immigrant students served in the current year. They add this number to the public school count when calculating the following year's award. The award's amount in order to reimburse the LEA for its services provided to EL and immigrant students. Next slide. Now, Title IV. Title IV Part A is to provide students access to well-rounded educational opportunities to improve school conditions for students learning and improve the use of technology, academic achievement, and digital literacy. Private school services may focus on one or more of these areas. However, this must be determined through consultation with the private school officials and also be based on student need. It is also important to note that the percentage requirements that apply to each of the Title IV programs, the program areas for LEAs that receive over $30,000 in Title IV funds, do not apply to private schools. The percentage requirements only apply at the overall LEA level. Some example of Title IV services are listed on the slide, such as college and career guidance counseling, school-based mental health services, and professional development on effective use of technology, to name a few. And here's a screenshot for the CE's method of calculating equitable services proportional share for Title IV, which like the sample shows for the other programs, provide a walkthrough of how the process for determining for equitable share amount. For Title IV Part A, equitable share districts will determine the per pupil amount based on the LEA's total Title IV allocation, less administrative and indirect costs, and the total enrollment of both public and nonprofit private school students. We've included link to the CDE's Title IV webpage, which provides additional information on Title IV equitable services. So this concludes my section. Now I'm going to turn it over to Helen and Jeannie.
Thank you, Debbie. This part of our presentation, we will reiterate and remind you of some of the key requirements of equitable services. Please remember that funds allocated to the LEAs for educational services and other benefits to eligible non-profit private school students, teachers, and other educational personnel and families must be obligated in the fiscal year for which the funds are received. Please keep in mind that the fiscal year for federal funds go until September 30th. So during your consultation, please consider this timeline to which the private school may be seeking services. For example, if a private school would like to do a summer school program, LEA should consider it during consultation. And as mentioned earlier in the presentation, all allowable services must be secular, neutral, non-ideological, and supplemental, and costs must be allowable, necessary, and reasonable. Moreover, under ESSA, funds cannot be directly paid to the private school. It is the LEA that will determine the proportional share of funds to be allocated for equitable services to participating private schools, and all curriculum, equipment, and other materials purchased to implement this program are the property of the LEA. So continuing, one key component to remember is that funds cannot benefit the private school. This means that the funding is not for general use. Funding cannot finance the existing level of instruction in private school or otherwise benefit the school itself. So the allowable uses must be agreed upon and support program implementation, including specific strategies to support eligible students, as Augustine shared earlier in the presentation, to achieve academic outcomes that are determined through consultation. In order to plan appropriate services, it would require an understanding of the existing level of instruction or private school's core program. What instruction, including EL instruction, What services, equipment, materials, and professional development are already in place? Because based on the needs of the eligible private school students, what services would best meet their needs? If purchasing equipment or materials, these should not be intended for the benefit of the entire school, but only for the program for eligible students. Therefore, the district, in consultation with the private school, would also discuss control for unauthorized uses. And to reiterate, public control of funds means that the LEA must retain control of funds for equitable services entitled to materials, equipment, and property purchased with such funds. In other words, no funds may go directly to a private school. Under public control of services, services must be provided by employees of a public agency or through a contract by a public agency with an individual, association, agency, or organization. If during consultation it is decided that a third-party contractor is to be used, the contract is between the LEA and the contractor in provision of those services. The employees and the person in association or other entities, they must be independent of the private school and of any religious organization, and the employment or contract must be under, again, the control and the supervision of the public agency. Private schools should not be the ones signing any contracts. Control over equipment and supplies can become problematic for many reasons, including requirement that these materials and supplies are not to benefit the private school. So, funds are to meet specific needs of eligible students, and again, not the needs of the private schools or general needs of the students. So when going through consultation, the need for certain equipment or supplies are determined. How do you ensure administrative control? The district should purchase the item. They should be labeling and inventoried, and they are the property of the district and not the private school. If needed for the Title I program, how might you ensure that they are used for Title I students? In addition, remember that the items purchased are not permanent fixtures to the private school. They must be removable without remodeling, as they should be able to remove them when the program is no longer in place or no longer needed. One of the things to be careful with equipment is that, remember, like longer an item stays at the private school, the item begins to feel like they belong to the private school. One practice the district might consider is pulling the item in at the end of each school year for inventory, so they do not just sit in the private school year after year. And upon consultation for the new school year, it can be determined whether that same equipment is necessary for a planned program for eligible students. Districts must label as a property of the district and under Title I. And again, how would you ensure that it is not used for general needs of the private school, but for the needs of the Title I students? Another aspect related to the control of funds is the use of personnel to implement programs. If private school personnel will be involved in the implementation of the programs, there are a few keys to remember. This is the district's program, even if you are using private school's teacher, and therefore, the services performed should be under the supervision of the district, meaning the program should be monitored and involve program visits. Through consultation, the plan for use of private school personnel should clearly define the contract for services and ensure that the program and any related PD is outside the regular hours of the private school staff's members' regular duty hours, because the funds cannot be used to finance the existing level of instructions, as we said previously. In addition, the contract should be in line with the district's procedures and policies. If the plan is to use public school personnel from your district, the services being provided should again be supplemental to the core program and for eligible students agreed upon through the consultation process. Right now, I'll turn it over to Jeannie for more information on other key requirements and some red flags.
Thanks, Helen. Let's continue with a few important fiscal control reminders related to staff implementing equitable services programs at the private school. Under the ESSA, no funds may be paid directly to the private school. If private school teachers are hired by the LEA, they should only be working outside regular duty hours. This is because the program cannot be used to finance existing services. With workshops and conferences, the district may reimburse the employee directly, but never the private school directly. And in such case, substitutes cannot be funded because the sub would be providing services for the benefit of the school and not specific to the program for eligible students. Also, for any payment to private school staff attending PD, they must only be paid a stipend for hours attended outside their regular hours, and again paid to the teacher, not to the private school. Some other fiscal reminders are offered here. Under ESSA, LEAs can charge reasonable and necessary administrative costs. Because equitable share is taken off the top of the total allocation, an LEA may reserve funds from the proportionate share for an amount that is reasonable and necessary to administer the program. This should be determined as part of consultation. In terms of carryover, ESSA requires the LEA to obligate funds for equitable services in the year for which they are appropriated. The process of consultation should ensure throughout the year that the intended plan is progressing and limit situations in which funds are left unspent. According to federal guidance, there may be extenuating circumstances in which the LEA is unable to obligate all funds, and then those funds must be used for equitable services the following year, subject again to consultation. With supplement not supplant, services are not to take the place of district services. The term not to benefit the school applies, so the general idea is that services cannot replace or finance the existing level of instruction at the school or basic services being provided at the school. With transferability, the key idea is that the district must consult with private schools before making any decisions to transfer funds. And for interagency agreements, because Title I Part A eligible students may attend private schools in adjoining districts, the LEA of residents may arrange to have services provided by another LEA. If the LEA makes such an arrangement, the two LEAs must establish an interagency agreement, which spells out the details of the reimbursement, indicating the per pupil amounts for the number of children served. The LEA of residents then must reimburse the LEA that provides the Title I services at the per pupil amount rate of Title I Part A participating school attendance area of the child's residence. We'll talk next in the next few slides about a few red flags. First, we consider a few problematic situations where use of funds would provide benefit for the private school overall and not specifically support the equitable services program intended to address the academic needs that were identified through consultation. For instance, consider the purchase of items for general use at the private school, such as library books, whiteboards for classrooms or computers, and software placed in classrooms. These types of purchases provide an overall benefit to all students and the school. This is not an allowable use of Title I funds at private schools. Additional red flags include using Title I funds at private schools for general instructional or curricular workshops, or for general data analysis training for all teachers, or for providing general courses leading to teacher certification. In all these instances, the actions would benefit the entire school or the entire classroom without regard to the student's eligibility for services. Such uses of Title I funds clearly would not focus on the targeted program designed through consultation to address the specific needs of Title I students at the private school. And so finally, funding is not for general use. Allowable uses must be agreed upon and support program implementation, including specific strategies to support Title I students to achieve academic outcomes that are determined through the consultation process. Here we consider some red flags that can signal a lack of district control. For example, if private schools are signing timesheets, this is a red flag that the LEA is not maintaining their legal oversight for services being delivered that were planned through consultation. If contractors are determining services that are going to be provided, this does not indicate district control. All services to be provided, whether by district employees or through employees contracted with the LEA to implement a specific program, need to be developed through consultation. Outside contractors should not be the ones who determine programs to be provided or areas to be addressed, and then charge the district for their services. Similarly, another red flag would be if private schools officials are telling the LEA they arranged for PD and then are sending an invoice. If there was no discussion during consultation prior to the private school staff attending that particular PD, this would signal that the PD was not being provided as part of the program plan that was designed through consultation. Likewise, budgets and purchase orders submitted to the district from private school officials are problematic, and they do not reflect consultation for program development and related services to be provided. Sending invoices, in other words, to the LEA makes it apparent that the district is not maintaining control of the funds. And here we consider red flags indicating inadequate program evaluation. As part of the services that are planned through consultation, you heard earlier that there is a requirement for districts to conduct program evaluation. If there is no program evaluation of equitable services in private schools, this is a red flag. Consultation that does not develop and include the process and the metrics that will be used for evaluation to reflect on program implementation and effectiveness can be a first sign that the district is not prepared to or is not intending to evaluate the district's programs at the private school as required. Additionally, without measurable benchmarks included and agreed upon when designing the program evaluation process during consultation, it will not be clear what data the LEA plans to use or how the LEA plans to analyze the results with the private school to inform the LEA and private school community about the impact of strategies and how to modify or improve the program the following year. Just as is done in public schools, a program evaluation should impact decisions for how equitable services are planned in the upcoming school year. Also, when data for program evaluation is limited only to collecting pre- and post-test scores and does not include multiple measures and a process to reflect on multiple data sources and program implementation necessary to determine effectiveness, it does not support the required and purposeful program evaluation. And I'll finish up this section addressing the key requirements addressing the complaint process. A nonprofit private school official has the right to file a complaint to the state education agency that the LEA did not engage in consultation that was meaningful and timely, did not give consideration to the views of the nonprofit private school official, or did not make a decision that treats the nonprofit private school students equitably. If the LEA disagrees with the views of the private school officials with respect to an issue pertaining to consultation, the LEA shall provide in writing to the private school officials the reasons why the LEA disagrees. And on the next slide, we take a look at the steps in the complaint process for complaints addressing equitable services. At the consultation level, a private school official may meet with the LEA and attempt to resolve the issue. They may also file a complaint with the LEA using the Uniform Complaint Procedure, or the private school may contact the state's ombudsman to seek resolution for a complaint using the state complaint process. UCP complaints are filed with the district superintendent or their designee for alleged violation of specific federal and/or state programs that use categorical funds, which include complaints addressing the ESSA. Depending on the outcome, a private school may appeal the decision of the state education agency to the U.S. Department of Education. The CDE Ombuds webpage includes an FAQ addressing the complaint process, and the response recommends that the private school officials file a complaint with the LEA through the LEA Uniform Complaint Process, or they can file a complaint directly with the state education agency, which is the CDE, through the state UCP office. We will conclude our presentation this afternoon with Adrian addressing the federal program monitoring process for equitable services.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you, everyone. Okay, we're on the very home stretch here. So as we wrap up, we've covered Title I, II, III, and IV of the federal programs and how they relate to equitable services. LEAs are responsible for creating and maintaining programs that meet the minimum fiscal and programmatic requirements. The federal and state laws require the CDE to monitor the implementation of categorical programs operated by LEAs. And so we have the Federal Program Monitoring Reviews, also known as FPMs, and this is the process for reviewing the LEA's implementation of their federal programs. So what we've done is we've pulled out from the FPM instruments where and what items are related to the private school consultation and participation and other aspects of implementing the equitable services. So in CE, compensatory education, in this instrument, CE3 and CE17 are specifically addressing private schools. And so for CE3, if you can go back, is private school consultation and participation. And the evidence that's requested for the Title I program would be the consultation with private schools, their intent to participate, and the private school affirmation. In CE17, on the next slide, is the LEA's public control of funds. And so in looking at this, we've heard many times throughout this presentation about this is the district's program and its local control of the district itself. And so the evidence that is being requested is the funding allocations that you have for the private schools, the LEA's summary budget and expenditure reports that show services for the private school students, and any third-party provider contracts and invoices as applicable. In the Title II program, the Supporting Effective Instruction Program instrument is used. And for this, SEI3 is to review and revise the LCAP federal addendum. And what this is it's not so much evidence that's requested that pertains to equitable services for under SEI3, but what it is in there is that the signed assurances that you do to receive these funds, one of those for Title II is to ensure that you will allow the participation by private school students and teachers in Title II, your Title II program. So we wanted to point this out. In SEI 8, This one actually specifically addresses the participation of private school and the consultation and the LEA control of funds all under your Title II program. And then for Title III, this one is found under Title I's CE compensatory education program instrument. So when you are also providing the Title I in CE 1 or CE 3's information and documents, you're also going to be providing the evidence for Title III programs. So you're going to include the consultation that shows and indicates Title III, the intent to participate, and the private school affirmation. And then in CE 17, the LEA, the public control of funds, again, you're showing your Title I, but you're also reflecting the evidence for your Title III program. So again, you're making sure that it's a dual purpose, but you do need to include under the Title I compensatory education review, you would also provide your equitable services documents for Title III. And then lastly, moving to your Title IV program, which is your student support and academic enrichment. The instrument used here focuses on SSAE 6 for equitable services. So in this item, you're looking at the evidence requests of a property records consultation with private schools, approval of capital expenditures, private school affirmation, needs assessment, general ledger, and invoices, all pertaining to your Title IV program. And then also to make note for the SSAE 7 federal transferability. So just making sure that if you do transfer funds, that there is some type of a consultation with private schools, and it is required to let them know how it's being affected, how the program is affecting equitable services. So there needs to have a conversation with the private school. And so again, you might share those general ledgers, consultation with private schools that took place, and any other planning documents used. And so as we close, we want to always remind everyone that your equitable services is your program. You're not giving these schools a pot of money and letting them determine. So what really needs to take place here is how do you talk about your private schools, and what language do you use? It shouldn't be the private school program. It should be services to provide to private school students and teachers, or it should be materials on loan from the district to support. They don't belong, again, to the private school. Those materials and equipment belong to you. And then also for the private schools, contractors or service providers, again, looking and focusing on the identified needs and services that may need support through these particular contracts or vendors. And so again, we want to remind you that the initial meeting is critical in having clear policies and procedures, to have transparent criteria for decision making. You need to have clear district role and responsibilities for planning and implementing, and as mentioned earlier, the evaluation process. And of course, your professionalism, it sets the tone. And really what's critical here is the relationship. The better relationship you have with your private schools, the more trust you have between both parties, that you really can get all of the evidence needed from them and all the documents that's needed in order to implement the programs at the private school. So again, it's really bridging that relationship and making sure that they're focused on the students. And so we've also provided some links to the resources. And so the first link is to the CDE Equitable Services Ombudsman's webpage. And this has quite a few resources. It has FAQs and links to the web pages for Title I, II, III, and also the method for calculating the equitable services proportional share for each of the programs. We've also included the links to the updated Title I Equitable Services Non-Regulatory Guidance and the new Title VIII Equitable Services Non-Regulatory Guidance, which applies to the other federal programs such as Title II, III, and IV. And so this concludes our presentation. Again, we want to thank you for joining us today, and we welcome your questions in the chat if you have any. And if we have some, we'll definitely put them together and follow up with a Q&A that we will email to you, as well as we will be posting the Q&A, the presentation, and this video on our Canvas webpage. Our contact information is on the next page, but before that, we want you to we would like to invite you to complete the evaluation for today's workshop. Here you can follow the link or the QR code and you can give us your feedback. We definitely use this so that we can meet your needs. And as we know, we had a mixture of veterans here as well as new people to Equitable Services. So we want to be able to meet everyone's needs. So again, thank you again for joining us. And we want to wish you a wonderful day.